Hello and welcome to episode 31 of Not Reserving Judgment, a podcast about the latest intrigues, triumphs, and outrages in Canadian constitutional law. I'm Josh DeHaas, counsel with the Canadian Constitution Foundation.
I'm Christine Van Gyn, the CCF's litigation director.
And I'm Joanna Barron, the CCF's executive director. In today's episode, we'll tell you about the termination of an Ontario librarian whose apparent crime was advocating for a more intellectually diverse book collection.
We'll walk you through the heartbreaking decision of a Calgary judge to allow a woman to access assisted suicide over the objections of her father.
And we'll share our bad legal takes of the week, where we take a lighthearted look at some legal opinions that didn't quite land. But first, I'm going to tell you about some exclusive new survey results on Canadians' views on the healthcare system. So this research was conducted by Leger, which is probably the most respected pollster around. It was conducted on behalf of us, along with the Montreal Economic Institute and secondstreet.org. Leger surveyed just over 2,000 people, asking them a big number of questions on the healthcare system. And we did this poll because we support more choice in healthcare, and we believe the current system designed to suppress any private payments, even where people are languishing in pain on waiting lists, violates their fundamental rights. And so we're always looking for ways to, better understand what people are thinking. Now, I have to admit, having read many polls like this over the years, and despite having heard a lot of horror stories lately, I was nonetheless pretty surprised by some of these results. Probably the biggest surprise was that nobody is buying what until very recently was the consensus among mainstream media, most politicians, and most academics, which is that the healthcare system isn't really broken, it just needs more public funding. You hear that a lot less from the media post-COVID, but you still hear it far too much considering where Canadians are actually at. So about 4 in 5, 83% told the pollster that they agreed with the statement, healthcare controlled by politicians isn't working, major change from the current situation is needed. Meanwhile, only about 5% said that the system doesn't need changing, just more public funding. Another thing that was surprising to me was that women were far more likely to say that they believe the healthcare system will be worse for future generations without major change. About 72% of women said that it'll be worse, while only about 62% of men agreed with that. And our pollster explained that this is probably because women do more of the caregiving, whether it's looking after the kids or grandma. And so they're more likely to realize that the system is failing because they have more contact with the system. Another tidbit I actually drafted an op-ed on that I'm still trying to get published is that people really don't want to pursue a public pharmacare program, at least until the basics are fixed. As listeners know, part of the NDP and Liberal deal to keep the Liberals in power for one more year is that the government will create universal pharmacare, and they only plan on doing the first step, which is taxpayer-funded diabetes and birth control drugs. But the plan, theoretically at least, is to eventually cover everything at an estimated cost of $40 billion a year. And to put that in perspective, Ontario released its budget yesterday, and it plans to spend just over twice that amount on the entire healthcare system, which is by far the most costly thing the government does. So adding pharmacare would entail an enormous expansion of government. And yet those surveyed ranked pharmacare as their lowest priority, with only 3% picking it as their number one option out of 9 options presented to them. The top priorities by far are, surprise, surprise, family doctors, shorter ER wait times, and shorter wait times for surgeries and treatments. So this suggests the Liberals and NDP are pretty out of touch on this, and that shows in the polls. The last really interesting thing from these results is that they were broken down into 2 groups, Quebecers and people in the rest of Canada. And Quebecers were similar on most measures, but they were far less likely to say that wait times for diagnostic tests like MRIs and CT scans are a problem. And I have a theory about that based on a paper that I read from C.D. Howe Institute last night. So in Quebec, you can just buy an MRI or a CT scan if you need one. MRIs are about $800. That's not cheap, but it is cheap enough if you have the money to do it, and if you're worried about dying on a waiting list for an MRI. So if you're concerned that you have cancer, you can go and get an MRI in Quebec if the public system is taking too long, whereas in Ontario, that's not allowed. So in Ontario, you'd be out of luck unless you're willing to go to Gatineau or Buffalo. So the reason Ontario blocks private scans, even though it has an ostensibly conservative government that would presumably favor more private options, is probably because of the 2018 diagnostic services policy put out by the Trudeau government. And so it turns out that under the Canada Health Act, which is the federal law that outlines the terms on which Ottawa will give funding to the provinces for healthcare, whether provinces are required to ensure diagnostic tests in order to get federal funding is actually pretty unclear. For those who don't know, the Canada Health Act basically says the federal health minister must withhold funding from provinces for if provinces do certain things, like allow doctors to bill more than what the public system pays, whether outside of hospitals or in it, and it explicitly bars certain user fees. It also sets out 5 criteria that provinces are supposed to meet to qualify for public funding, and one of those is comprehensiveness. And the comprehensiveness section says the healthcare insurance plan of a province must ensure all insured health services provided by hospitals and medical practitioners, which basically means doctors. So does that include MRI clinics? Ontario thinks it does. Most other provinces think otherwise. But the Trudeau government sided with those who believe that it includes diagnostic tests. And so this 2018 policy basically says they're going to punish provinces for allowing people languishing on waitlists to go to a private clinic and pay to get their scan. And last year, they actually did just that in a news story that I know I missed at the time, so probably a lot of other people missed it. Ottawa actually subtracted $41 million from its transfers to Quebec, $17 million from its transfers to BC, $14 million from its transfers to Alberta, and lower amounts from other provinces, just because those provinces allowed people to pay for, MRIs or CT scans that they couldn't get in the public system. So anyway, to me, this is absolutely insane, considering that between, 2022 and 2023, Ontario's diagnostic scans waitlist grew by 44%, while Quebec's declined, almost certainly because Quebec allows some people to, exit the public system and pay to get their MRI rather than waiting on that wait list. So anyway, if Ontario allowed private payments for scans, we would get dinged by the federal government, and that just seems crazy. So anyway, I'm getting all worked up about this. Is there anything you wanted to add, Joanna?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack in this survey. I hope that your op-ed gets published soon. But one thing, and I was really happy to see that it's only 5% of Canadians polled that think that just throwing more money at the problem without any type of other fundamental change will do the trick. I'm just looking at numbers from 2023 from OECD, and Canada spends over 11% of our GDP on healthcare, compared to a 9.2% average of healthcare spending as a percentage of GDP in the OECD. And our outcomes in terms of waiting times and other outcomes, patient satisfaction, are second to last in the OECD, so in developed countries. So clearly just shoveling more money at the problem determinedly doesn't work. And I'm glad that has gotten across. I think that the Overton window and the dominant point of view on that has really shifted just in the last few years. I think the pandemic just pushed things way past the boiling point. So I'm very cautiously optimistic. Do you have anything to add, Christine?
Yeah, the thing that stands out in this, the perspective of women, a lot of people think women wouldn't be supportive of reform to Canada's healthcare system, but it's exactly as you say, Josh. I think that it's women, and at least in my experience in my own household, anecdotally, it's women who drive medical appointments. Like, I am in charge of the medical appointments for my kids. I'm also mostly in charge of medical appointments for my husband. So this is, I hate the term lived experience, but my lived experience is that I have many more interactions with the healthcare system than my husband does. So I am the one who gets frustrated with the failures of the system more than anyone else in my household. Another thing that was interesting that I saw recently was there's a tweet by, I'm not going to say who it was, but it's like a progressive female lawyer who posted about this app called Maple, which if you don't know, Maple is a app for virtual appointments with a doctor right away. And it also can refer you to specialists. And she said, this is Maple. Let me walk you through what it is. When, you're for $90 a month, because it's a subscription service, you get more than you do from your OHIP card. And I thought it was her, like attacking Maple. And then I went to the comments and she's like, I subscribe to Maple so that I can get my healthcare prescription renewed without having to deal with the family clinic that can never fit me in. And it's expensive, but I need this. And I was like, oh, I really do think that the Overton window has shifted, because I think 10 years ago, this would obviously by progressives have been an attack on this entrepreneurial company, but instead it was a woman endorsing it. So love to see it. I will go on now to my headline, which also relates sort of peripherally, I guess, to the healthcare system. It's a really sad news headline, actually. It's about medical assistance in dying and a case from Alberta. Now, medical assistance in dying, I think is a controversial term itself. Some people say it is just assisted dying or assisted suicide or even euthanasia. And the issue of assisted dying has been a very controversial one since it was expanded in Canada, first in a Supreme Court case called Carter. And the current Trudeau government has put a hold on the planned expansion of assisted dying. It was actually set to expand this month, March, to include medical assistance in dying for people who are solely suffering from mental illness, which raises some obvious concerns. The original expansion in Carter was supposed to be for people who are suffering from untreatable or terminal conditions. The classic examples that we think of are ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease and terminal late-stage cancer. But we have obviously moved well beyond that. In Canada, there have been about 45,000 MAID deaths since the introduction of legislation in 2016. And in 2022, there were 13,000 MAID provisions reported in Canada. And this Wikipedia article where I got this data cited says this accounts for 4.1% of all deaths in Canada, and that this is a growth rate of 31% over 2021. By the way, that Wikipedia article is called Euthanasia in Canada. So there are a lot of concerns about medical assistance in dying from the disability community, who worry not only is medical assistance in dying going to be used to kill people with disabilities instead of providing them with adequate services, but there are concerns that the medical system will actually pressure people with disabilities into killing themselves through MAID. And there actually have been reports of this type of pressure happening or being applied. So let's talk about this case in Calgary. So the case was decided this week, and it involved a 27-year-old woman with autism. And that her only known medical diagnosis, as described in the court, is autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. She lives with her father, and her father opposes her plan to have medical assistance in dying. But she was approved for MAID, and I'll get into how that approval took place. But her father got this interim injunction to stop it from happening. It was supposed to happen in the family home. He got the interim injunction, I think the day before it was supposed to take place. So the way to get approved for medical assistance in dying is you need to or in Alberta, is you need to have 2 doctors or nurse practitioners sign off. And in this woman's case, one of these doctors or nurse practitioners agreed that she is eligible for MAID and the other didn't. So Then she got a third tiebreaker doctor, and that doctor signed off. And Alberta has no appeal process or way of reviewing a person's approval for MAID. So the father, this woman's father, asked for a judicial review of the approval. And the court found that the court can't review a MAID applicant's decision making, or because he argued that her autism compromised her decision making ability, her mental condition compromised it. And there also isn't a way to review, the court said, a judgment, a clinical judgment from doctors or these nurse practitioners. They could only review whether the Alberta Health Services had followed their own policy. So the result in this case was that the court set aside that interim injunction that the father had obtained to stop the euthanasia, and it can now go ahead. Now, I find this to be a really horrible story. It is so sad. I think it is clearly showing that there are insufficient guardrails on medical assistance in dying. I also think that this shows that very obviously MAID has expanded well beyond the original court ruling in the Carter case at the Supreme Court. And it also is a bit strange that since there is a freeze on medical assistance in dying for people with mental illness, it's strange that this case, this woman's case, where her only diagnoses are autism and ADHD, that she was approved. Anthony Koch, a political commentator, has said he's called this case eugenics, but make it woke. And the professor at University of Toronto who does a lot of work on medical assistance in dying, Trudeau Lemons, called this the morbid fetishization of self-determination. So I do think that it's possible to have a nuanced take on MAID. I don't think you need to be a conscientious objector to all medical assistance in dying. Someone who is terminally ill and suffering terrible pain and will die imminently, that's clearly a very different story from someone who is, like in this case, a physically healthy young woman who has autism. And a diagnosis of autism can actually cause people, and I'm not saying that this is what happened in this case, but we know that autism can cause people to fixate on certain things and perhaps even including death. Although we don't know if that's what happened in this case with this patient. So, the court emphasized that the patient's dignity and self-determination outweighed the harm, which in this case is death. And my view is that MAID in cases like this does not affirm the dignity of people with disabilities. And I think that having 3 doctors or nurses is, that being the system, debating whether or not you should kill yourself and then disagreeing. I mean, this is like a completely outrageous process and system. And there are clear problems with how this is happening in Canada, which is why we're the subject to a lot of international scorn for how our medical assistance and dying system operates. I have so many concerns for the disability community about this whole case, this process, the whole system. Josh, what's your reaction to this terrible case?
It's really sad, and I think it's astonishing to see like how far we've gone from, someone like Carter from the Carter case, who had what the Supreme Court called like a grievous and irremediable medical condition, something that is not going to get better and that is going to kill you and it's going to cause you huge pain and suffering, and being entitled to, doctor assistance in that scenario to, where we're going to allow people who have autism and ADHD to kill themselves. I think that's pretty awful. And the thing about Carter was, the court considered whether this would be a slippery slope, whether we, allow medical assistance in dying for that case that I think a lot of people, like certainly polling shows that most Canadians agree with, which is the grievous and irremediable medical condition, to, basically now if you have some form of mental illness, and, almost anything can be diagnosed as like a mental illness, then we're going to allow those people to have medical assistance. In other words, we're not going to criminalize doctors who help those people end their lives, even though to a lot of us that seems pretty evil. So the slippery slope has been very slippery, as they often are. You know, it's been less than a decade that we've gone from that to this situation, and I don't think the federal government needs to go ahead with what it currently has planned. A lot of what they're planning is based on a Quebec case called Truchon, and Truchon, they didn't even appeal. Like, they didn't even let the Court of Appeal take a look at that case. So yeah, the slippery slope has come true, and I think it's time to sort of reverse course. And yeah, those are my thoughts. Joanna, I know you have thoughts on this. What do you think?
Yeah, well, just briefly, you guys have said most of them, but yeah, the slippery slope in this case has turned into like a terrifying, hurtling roller coaster. I mean, over 30% growth rate over 2021. That's like an exponential effect. And my fear is that the courts are fairly toothless, and all they have the vocabulary to do is to just parrot this discourse of dignity and self-determination, dignity and self-determination. Like, that is sort of the language of rights and the language of the charter. So I am not particularly optimistic in the ability of the courts to stem this. And also, just as a reminder, the government, the Liberals, back in 2015, actually had what I thought to be a very mature, very morally serious, and very incremental legislative response to Carter. Carter actually didn't limit the availability of a medically assisted suicide under Section 7 to terminal illnesses. It did say grievous and irredeemable harm, medical harm. And then the Liberal government, which was then shepherded by Jody Wilson-Raybould, assisted by my friend Jessica Prince, they did a very lengthy consultation with stakeholders. They had a lot of time to listen to concerns about conscientious objection and conscious rights and safeguards. And they did limit the availability of medically assisted suicide to cases of terminal illness. Of course, many members in the Liberal caucus at the time openly said that they thought that, you know, court challenges would gradually open it up. But I thought that was an interesting instance of dialogue theory, right? Where the courts say this is the framework, and Parliament, you have to act to pass legislation to legalize some type of physician-assisted suicide. And Parliament said, you know, our take, being in touch with stakeholders from the community, is that the community is not ready for this outside of terminal illness. And by the way, that's sort of my kind of moral line, that as a libertarian, I don't think I have any basis to say to an adult who's compos mentis, who is on the course for death and is suffering. I don't have any basis that I see that I can tell that person that they should not be able to choose to end their life in a way that is comfortable and peaceful. But we're talking about something completely different now, right? As you mentioned, Christine, autism can include hyperfixation. And it's not paternalistic to say that the moral position should be at least to have some type of cooling off period. So yeah, this is fairly horrifying to me. I don't know why it happened, given the freeze on expanding access to MAID for mental illness, but this is just one of thousands of horror stories I've heard. And this is really already a moral horror show, in my opinion.
Yeah, the government actually had a report where they talked about cost savings associated with MAID, which is really, really morbid. Obviously, it's extremely expensive for a social safety net system like we have in Canada to support people with disabilities. It's costly. It's a lot less expensive to kill people than pay for their lives. But that is a monstrous moral position to take.
Yeah, but where we can only speak in the language of rights, of dignity and self-determination, and we have no sort of common conception of, I'm sorry to say this, but the value of life, right? Because people get creeped out and think that it's, you know, pro-life or religious when you start to talk about that, but we don't have any collective language. So I guess my takeaway to the listener is, don't depend on the courts and the charter to stop this backsliding. This needs to be something that comes from the people and ultimately Parliament, because I do think there are parliamentarians who have concerns about this, and I just don't think the courts are going to save us. Okay, well, with that, on that light note, why don't we take a break? And when we come back, I will tell you about a story out of Niagara-on-the-Lake.
Hi, I'm Russell from the CCF. In case you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our email newsletter, The Freedom Update, to get updates from me every week about our ongoing work and the legal stories in Canada that keep us interested. It's one of the best ways to stay up to date. Subscribe at theccf.ca/freedomupdate.
Okay, so I want to tell you guys about a story that has come up over the last few weeks from Niagara-on-the-Lake. A woman named Cathy Simpson, who was the head librarian, actually the CEO of Niagara-on-the-Lake's public library, was terminated without cause 3 years short of her retirement recently. And I'll get into the backstory as to why. So this started on February 22nd. A local newspaper in Niagara-on-the-Lake published an op-ed on the importance of viewpoint diversity in public libraries. This was written by Ms. Simpson, the CEO of Niagara-on-the-Lake's public library. She'd been in the role for over a decade. And she wrote, "We will only be truly free to read when authors are no longer afraid to write on any topic. Publishers no longer prioritize an author's identity over their work's merit. Teachers no longer present students with only one viewpoint on issues, and library workers ensure their collections are balanced to include a variety of perspectives on controversial topics." Simpson went on to praise the Toronto City public librarian Vickery Bowles, who has stood up for intellectual freedom and viewpoint diversity. She also spoke about how she had witnessed increasing censorship in curation of library collections and was disturbed to these threats to free speech. She wrote that she was a proponent of quote unquote library neutrality and pluralism, and connected this to a group called the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, or FAIR, which is a US not-for-profit that also has chapters in Canada. So seems like fairly trenchant stuff, worthy of consideration. However, shortly after this article appeared, a resident of Niagara-on-the-Lake named Matt French sent a letter to a news website which accused Simpson of dog whistles and promoting quote unquote right-wing propaganda. Now, as all of this is coming up and heat is sort of being shed on Cathy Simpson, the library board members started to look into some new acquisitions that Simpson had chosen and put out and instructed her staff to put out for something called Freedom to Read Week, which was meant to, again, promote viewpoint diversity, promote intellectual openness, as well as exposure to multiple points of view. And her staff had said that they were shocked and refused to do it. So I'll just list off a few examples of the books that she had ordered and wanted to display. Irreversible Damage by Abigail Schreier, Thomas Sowell's Social Justice Fallacies, Grave Error by Tom Flanagan, How the Woke Won, Canada's COVID Panic, Story of a Moral Panic by Barry Cooper and Marco Navarro, a book by Kathleen Stock, who is known as a TERF, a trans-exclusionary radical feminist. And staff members, after seeing this list, came forward to say that they were uncomfortable with some of these choices. Now, a spokesperson for the library who was interviewed by a local paper said that interpreting library policies on censorship and acquisitions can require, quote unquote, a bit of judgment, and concluded that this came down to the fact that essentially board members of the library and a number of staff all see things the same way, and Cathy sees things differently. That's why the decision was made that we'd have to part company. So in response to the letter and internal discussions, the board of directors first placed Simpson on paid leave, and then on March 19th, the board terminated her just 3 years shy of her retirement. Monica Harris, who's the executive director of FAIR, wrote a really interesting op-ed in the National Post following this whole affair. She wrote that the contention that certain views are unworthy of representation in a library misunderstands the responsibility of public institutions. Libraries have a sacred duty to provide access to all, including those whose perspectives are deemed offensive or heterodox. She also responded to some of the slurs, which not just Mr. French, but many library employees made as well, calling FAIR a homophobic or far-right group, writing that she herself was a gay Black woman. And Nadine Strawson, who's a noted civil rights advocate in the US, was a member of FAIR's board. So look, this is the type of story that culture warriors just salivate over. And look, I have to admit that list was a little bit aggressive. There was books on climate skepticism, trans issues, residential schools. I mean, like, she just hit on every contentious issue. She was definitely throwing elbows a little bit. However, none of these books represent perspectives that are outside of the Overton window, in my opinion. They are edgy, but that is the point of free expression. We're not talking about racism. We're not talking about Holocaust denial, all of which are, of course, repudiated by FAIR. So one way or another, you can't read this in any other way other than Cathy Simpson was being policed for wrongthink, and the system sort of chewed her up and spit her out. So Josh, I know that you had a conversation with Ms. Simpson, and we even wrote a letter in support of Ms. Simpson to the Niagara Public Library Board. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So yeah, we heard about this from FAIR, and FAIR is apparently a far-right extremist organization, according to this local person who got the librarian fired. It's not. It's a group of people that's very diverse, and they basically take the old-fashioned view of racism that most people accepted until pretty recently, which is that the goal should be colorblindness. Like, obviously, we're not colorblind, and we do treat people differently on the basis of race, so we stereotype and we do all these things, but the goal should be that eventually we treat everybody the same way, regardless of their race and things like this. And that's their basic idea. But apparently that is such an extremist idea that it cannot be, countenanced in a public library. And yeah, we wrote a letter. We didn't make a big deal of this publicly because Ms. Simpson, wasn't sure whether she would be terminated at that point. And so we wrote to the board and we said, look, Canadians have a right to freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression. And as taxpayer-funded entities, libraries are obligated to comply with the Charter. And the Supreme Court has long recognized that freedom of expression protects controversial and offensive ideas, and it protects not just the right to speak those ideas, but also the right to listen. And so, in a country with free expression, you should have library catalogs that reflect a very diverse range of viewpoints, and especially including books that challenge the prevailing orthodoxy. And nobody should be burning books or keeping them out of libraries, whether they're considered too extreme to the right or too extreme to the left. And there should be lots of books on sort of all sides of the issues. So yeah, we wrote this letter and we were hoping that it might influence the board. Clearly it did not. Ms. Simpson has been fired, apparently without cause, which is interesting. That's the most common type of way of ending someone's
I
did
did read that her severance is being negotiated. So there's at least that, because I think if you're fired with cause, then you don't get severance. So I was glad to see 3 years shy of retirement, she's getting something.
Yeah. And you know what? I hadn't even really thought about this, but based on my sort of limited employment law knowledge, she could, she would have been retiring at 65 and she might get 3 years of taxpayer funded severance. That's sort of that would be like the very, very high end of a pay in lieu of notice package. But I think she's going to get at least a couple of years. And so Niagara-on-the-Lake taxpayers will be funding this decision to get rid of their chief librarian because she expressed herself and her desire for more viewpoint diversity in the library collection. So, great job, everyone. Great job to this Matt French guy who
And I'm sure she'll
managed.
start, a second part of her career or final chapter of her career, which might be a lot more interesting now, right?
Yeah, I mean, she's certainly too young to retire, and I'm interested to see what she does next. So I'll leave it at that. But Christine, I know you were pretty outraged about this too. Anything to add before we do our bad
I
legal
was
takes?
really hoping that Pandemic Panic, the book Joanna and I wrote, was going to be one of the banned books. Like I would just, I am kind of one of those culture warriors, Joanna,
Yeah.
that you
Yeah.
that
Yeah,
you mentioned. So
you started drooling as soon as we got this email.
yeah, I mean, obviously, I don't think our book is really very controversial, but it would have been great if it was on the list. It would have been great fun. It's so ironic to me that this librarian came out saying I think that there's not enough viewpoint diversity, and the reaction of the library is we don't want to hear that viewpoint. Canceled. Like
Beyond the pale.
there's no self-awareness. It's completely outrageous, and it's a huge disservice to the people of Niagara-on-the-Lake, which is, a lovely community. I go there all the time because my TV studio is right beside there. I'm glad that she'll get some severance at taxpayer expense, but the community obviously would have been better served to having a excellent librarian with an open mind, bringing in books that have a variety of different perspectives. So it's a big loss to the community, I think. But let's move on now to our bad legal takes. I can start with mine. So my bad legal take, and I will defend that this is a legal take. It goes to Doug Ford for not knowing what a fourplex is. And I say that this is a legal take because to be permitted this is a type of residential building. So to be able to build fourplex buildings, the government would need to change policy through regulation and legislation at the provincial and municipal level. So fourplexes are illegal to build in most of Canada. The city of Toronto banned them in 1920. They banned most kinds of multiplexes in 1929. So as a result, we have mostly single family housing or apartments or townhouses. And zoning came in the 1920s. So for about 100 years now, we have had this model of mostly single family homes. And it made it in the 60s and 70s. From then onward, these rules were made even stricter for suburban redevelopment. So this has consequences because obviously Canada and the GTA in particular have a housing crisis. And the housing crisis is created by a whole lot of different factors, including rapidly increased immigration at the federal level, as well as bureaucratic restrictions on residential housing construction, both provincially and municipally. So one of the solutions that has been contemplated by a lot of people in this space is the construction of fourplexes. And a fourplex, and this what it actually is important. It is a residential building with 4 distinct housing units. And there are a couple of different ways to imagine it. One of the most common is 2 joined up duplexes and in a group of 4, and each of the duplexes would have 2 or 3 bedrooms. So it really creates, it's filling in that missing family home component that we're missing in the housing market. But Doug Ford has come out hard against fourplexes as the solution. Although based on his comments, I don't think he knows what they are. He said that the fourplex policy is off the table and would be a massive mistake and would raise the ire of residents living in traditional single family homes in the suburbs. And he said, I can assure you 1000%, if you go into communities and start putting up 4-story, 6-story, 8-story buildings right deep into community, there's going to be a lot of shouting and screaming. We're not going into communities to build 4, 6, 8-story buildings beside residents. I mean, a fourplex is not an 8-story building or a 6-story building. I mean, theoretically, I guess I can imagine there could be a 4-story fourplex depending on the layout, but it would be a pretty weird layout. Most designs for fourplexes, and you can just look them up on Google Images, most of them are 2 stories or maybe 3 stories. So it seems like Ford is talking about apartment buildings, which frankly, I don't think they should be ruled out because of NIMBYism. I think you should build apartment buildings too. And specifically, the proposal for fourplexes is around transit stations. But, building more apartments and building more fourplexes, I guess, is kind of a policy take, not a legal take. But my bad legal take goes to either Ford not knowing what a fourplex actually is, or creating a straw man argument by saying these are 8-story buildings so that he can say we don't want them. But really, this is a big part of the housing crisis solution. So misrepresenting what these are doesn't actually help solve anything. Josh, how about your bad legal take this week?
Manitoba's PC party has taken a proposal for a rights-infringing policy from that province's governing NDP and managed to make it even worse. So Manitoba has decided it's going to pass legislation to silence anti-abortion activists who, quote, perform an act of disapproval about abortion. In other words, use their constitutionally protected free expression rights within 50 or 150 meters of either facilities that provide abortions or abortion providers' homes. And these so-called bubble zones or buffer zones have been around for a while. British Columbia was the first to pass one in 1995. And it did that after an abortion doctor was actually shot in his home while eating breakfast. And BC's law has been upheld by the province's Supreme Court as a reasonable restriction on freedom of expression. Because there was this, genuine risk faced by abortion doctors at the time. But I've always thought it was pretty strange that this law was upheld, considering that, shooting someone or firebombing a clinic is already a very serious crime. And that's completely different from holding up a sign that says, abortion is murder. And yet the pro-abortion activists decided to take this opportunity to silence their critics, and they've been pretty successful doing this so far. Manitoba would actually be the 7th province to pass such a law restricting abortion or restricting protests against abortion after BC, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, Quebec, Ontario, and Saskatchewan. And as I mentioned, these bubble zones are being proposed sort of left and right, and they're a pretty big concern just because if you care about freedom of speech or assembly, you should be supporting people who want to protest in fairly controversial ways. Anyway, back to Manitoba. So the PCs, rather than standing up against this speech-limiting proposal, say they would like to actually expand the proposal so that it would cover not just abortion clinics, but also strikes by workers outside of health facilities, which has nothing to do with anything except maybe it gives them a reason not to vote for the bill without saying that they don't actually support what are some pretty obvious speech restricting measures on protests about outside abortion clinics. And to me, this is sort of like the silliest kind of politics that I've seen in a while. And I don't think the PC's amendment would be constitutional, considering the well-established right to assembly and to express oneself on a picket line. And so my bad legal take this week goes to the Manitoba PCs for this dumb proposed amendment to an already terrible law. Joanna, what's your bad legal take for this week?
Okay, so I have a fun bad legal take. My bad legal take goes to the 2 California shoppers who have filed a proposed class action lawsuit against the luxury retailer Hermes. In the complaint, the 2 individuals accuse the company of gating off the touted Birkin bag, the classic Birkin bag, for all but the highest spending customers. This is a practice that they allege violates antitrust law. One of the plaintiffs is already the owner of at least one Birkin bag, according to the complaint, but she was thwarted in her attempt to buy another one. She says that she has spent tens of thousands of dollars at Hermes and has been coerced into purchasing other Hermes items, such as ancillary products, homeware, scarves, makeup, jewelry before she was given a chance to buy a Birkin bag. And just as a side note, by the way, I find these Birkin bags, I know that the leather is beautiful, but I think they're actually pretty fugly. They look very matronly to me. Maybe I just like need to wait 10 years and
maybe it's sour grapes, Joanna.
Honestly,
maybe you're not rich enough.
I'm like, yeah, you can't. I'm certainly not rich enough, but as you guys know, I live like a 10-minute walk from Yorkville. So I see women carrying these, and you can't wear it crossbody. You have to hold it by the handles. The side of straps are always hanging out because it's like annoying to twist up the straps. I'm sorry. Like I think a classic Chanel bag is beautiful. I don't understand the frenzy over Birkins. Anyways, the second plaintiff says that Mr. Glenoga had no luck when he tried to buy a Birkin bag. The sales associate instructed him to purchase other items and accessories at the store before he would be considered as a potential customer for the quota bag, the Birkin bag. And so at the heart of their claim is the practice of quote unquote tying, which is the selling of certain very coveted items to customers on the condition that they buy another product. And other luxury businesses like Ferrari and Rolex also engage in these practices where their most exclusive and coveted products, which also have a very high secondary market resale value, are reserved to the most valued, most loyal and devoted customers. And their lawyer says that this is illegal because they're preconditioning buying other products before they give you the opportunity to buy a Birkin or a Kelly bag. However, the jurisprudence suggests that a judge is far more likely to rule that a sales practice such as this violates the law when the item in question can be deemed to be a necessity. So, for example,
a necessity. It's like you need your Birkin to live.
So, for example, no, a necessity would be like a drug company, which would condition access to life-saving medication only to those who bundle them or buy them with other products. So no, I'm sorry. Your rights are not violated because you had to buy some crockery and a few Hermes click bracelets or silk scarves before you could be invited into the back room to see your Birkin in Togo leather with gold hardware. Sorry, bad legal take. And also, you're going to be blacklisted by the brand for life, which I guess I am too now that I've come out as anti-Birkin.
I need my world's smallest violin for this case.
Yeah.
But what's fascinating is the kind of peek inside the world of the ultra rich and the positioning to get these coveted items is really interesting.
I have to be honest. Yesterday, I spent a little time on the subreddit called the Hermes game, which is all about women talking about their pre-spend quota and their ratio. And I was amazed to see that like professional women who are obviously making a lot of money, but who are not like, just like landowners are dropping, 20, 30, 40 grand for the opportunity. They say it's just like the best moment in their lives when then their sales associate utters the magic words, "Would you like to see a Birkin?"
Oh my God.
Amazing that we live in a country where people can spend $20,000 on bags, but they can't spend $20,000 to get their surgery or
apparently
their
the Toronto store, most of these are not in Canada. The Toronto store is apparently though one of the most competitive, and it was advised that you should fly to Vegas for the weekend and try your luck there rather than trying to get invited to buy a Birkin at the Bloor Street Hermes store. So
news you can use. We better wrap this up. We got a meeting in a few minutes, so as usual, we hope you'll rate us, review us, and subscribe. And just a reminder that you can support our work by subscribing to the CCF's YouTube channel, by following us on X, or by visiting our website, theccf.ca, where you can sign up for our Freedom Update newsletter from our colleague Russ. The Canadian Constitution Foundation is a nonpartisan legal charity funded by your donations, so please click that donate button on our website if you can. Thanks for listening.